Our second scripture reading for this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark. This is the final event in a section of Mark's Gospel that has been leading us to Jerusalem. The very next story in the Gospel will be the entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. In this section of the Gospel, Jesus has three different times explained to the disciples about his upcoming arrest, execution, and resurrection, but in each time they have not only misunderstood, but have acted in ways that demonstrates that misunderstanding. And now this section concludes, as the section began, with a healing of a man who was blind. Listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately, he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have shared before something that happened in the previous church I served, an event that's seared into my memory. It happened on a Sunday like this one as I was preaching from the pulpit, but I only saw it because of the peculiar architecture of that sanctuary. The back wall in that sanctuary was covered in windows its entire width. And so the choir and I could see out into the narthex through those windows. There were also entry doors from outside off to the sides, both sides of that narthex, but they were out of view from looking through those windows. Now, in this particular church, it was the custom of the ushers to remain out in the narthex or in the parlor just beyond it during the worship service. And the choir and I could see them as they milled about, went and got coffee from the parlor kitchen and so forth. And so it was that there was an usher in the narthex when a rather disheveled man entered it. The man was black, which made him a minority of one, unless the immigrant family from Cameroon that we sponsored happened to have been there that day. He may well have been homeless, but I don't know that. And I assumed he had come seeking some assistance. One of the ushers quickly intercepted him as he came into view. I could see them talking, but of course couldn't hear anything. They spoke for a little while, and then the usher ushered the man out of my view towards what I assume was the door he had just come in. It was easy to ascertain what had just happened, what I had witnessed. The man had come seeking some assistance and had likely asked to talk to the pastor. The usher had told him that I was busy in the middle of worship and he would need to come back later. And I never saw the man again. Something similar happens in our gospel reading this morning, although in this case it is a blind man who is looking for some assistance, seeking help. But Jesus is busy. Jerusalem is just over the horizon. No doubt Jesus has some final instructions that he needs to give to the disciples. No time for one more desperate person who needs some help. But this blind man, Bartimaeus, won't take no for an answer. He keeps yelling out, trying to get Jesus' attention. Even though he is blind, he realizes something that seems to have escaped the crowd and the disciples. Jesus came for people just like him, and Jesus will not turn him away. You'd think the disciples would have realized this as well. Jesus had just taught them that he came to serve and not to be served. And just prior to that, he had become indignant at the disciples for trying to shoo away parents who were bringing children for Jesus to bless. Over and over, Jesus has tried in this section of the gospel to explain to the disciples what he is doing, to tell them about his upcoming suffering, death, and resurrection. But they seem totally unable to comprehend, spiritually blind, if you will. Throughout this section of Mark's gospel, which began with the healing of another blind man, Jesus has repeatedly talked about his upcoming death and resurrection, but the disciples have responded by trying to correct him, by arguing over who is the greatest, and by asking for plum spots in Jesus' upcoming glory. They seem incapable of understanding, unable to see. But Jesus can cure blindness, which is why I think Jesus puts this healing where he does, right before entering Jerusalem. This healing looks different from most of the other ones in Mark's gospel. That's true of Bartimaeus' insistence that he be healed, and also of what happens after the healing. In the typical healing in Mark's gospel, Jesus tells the person to go home and not to tell anyone what Jesus has done for him. That's exactly what happened when Jesus healed a blind man to open this section of Mark's gospel. But it is different with Bartimaeus. For starters, Jesus credits Bartimaeus, his faith, with the healing. He says, "Go, your faith has made you well," which might well be translated, "Your faith has rescued you," or "Your faith has made you whole." Bartimaeus' trust, his trust in Jesus, makes great things possible. But even more surprising is what Jesus doesn't say after the healing. There are no words about going home and saying nothing to anyone. Instead, we hear, "And immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way." Bartimaeus is healed, and he follows Jesus, follows him to Jerusalem and to the cross. I think Mark's telling of this story is meant in a way to give hope to bungling disciples who over and over misunderstand, whose spiritual blindness leads them to argue over who's number one and who gets the best places in Jesus' inner circle. If they wish, their blindness can be healed. If they wish, they can follow Jesus on the way. The way was the name first applied to the movement that would later be known as Christian. Bartimaeus' faith and Jesus' power to heal enabled a former blind man to follow Jesus, to walk in the way of Jesus. And if they wish, Jesus' power to heal can allow spiritually blind disciples to walk in the way of Jesus. That's good news, because all too often my own attempts at following Jesus are every bit as bungling as those first disciples. I like having money and I wish I were rich. I find it difficult to love my enemies. The last thing I want is to suffer, and I have little use for crosses. I'm very much captive to the ways of individualistic consumerism of our culture. A culture addicted to the idea that happiness and contentment will follow if only I acquire just a little bit more. I struggle to see the way of Jesus, afflicted with a blindness every much as acute as it was with those first disciples that we see in Mark's gospel. If you sit down and read Mark's gospel from beginning to end, you might well conclude that Peter, James, John, and those other disciples are hopeless cases, doomed to forever fumble about in the throes of their spiritual blindness. But of course, these are the disciples who found the church, who sometimes at the cost of their own life began to spread the way of Jesus throughout the Mediterranean world. And I think this last healing in the gospel hints at this possibility. Jesus came to bring sight to the blind, and that includes, perhaps especially, those who are spiritually blind, who cannot see the truth of the way that Jesus comes to show. It takes a little faith, enough trust to turn to Jesus and ask for help. But mostly it happens because of the healing power of Jesus, who is able to rescue, to heal, to free me from captivity to ways that are ultimately not life-giving, and to open my eyes to the way of life in all its fullness, to the way of Jesus. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in Jesus to heal our blindness and to show us the way. Thanks be to God.